If you play this violin, I will marry you right here, right now." The millionaire's voice echoed through the grand ballroom, dropping over the elegant crowd like a crystal chandelier crashing onto the marble floor. For an entire second, nobody in the sprawling Newport, Rhode Island estate dared to breathe. Then, the laughter began. It started as a single, timid chuckle, almost embarrassed by its own cruelty, before spreading like wildfire until 200 guests, dressed in their finest evening wear, were roaring with amusement. They raised gloved hands to their mouths, leaning over the shoulders of their wealthy companions to murmur about what a deliciously elegant humiliation they were witnessing. Rachel Sullivan stood perfectly still in the center of the vast room, holding a silver tray with both hands, the champagne glasses trembling ever so slightly. She was 27 years old, wearing the blue and white uniform of the Anderson estate maids, her brown hair pulled back into a low, neat bun. Her striking green eyes were fixed firmly on the polished parquet floor, desperately wishing it would swallow her whole. "Did you not hear me?" Maxwell Anderson pressed, taking a confident step forward with the effortless smirk of a man who had never lost a single thing in his life. He was 30 years old, turning 31 tonight, his dark hair slicked back immaculately above a tailored black tuxedo that hugged the athletic frame of a man who spent his Sundays playing polo on the sprawling lawns of his estate. In his right hand, he held a honey-colored wooden violin, extending it toward her much like one might dangle a scrap of meat before a stray dog just to watch it jump. He was the master of the house, the sole heir to the largest real estate empire on the East Coast, celebrating his birthday surrounded by the most powerful elite of New York and New England. "I am making you a very serious offer," he continued, projecting his voice so every socialite in the room could savor the spectacle. "This instrument belonged to my grandmother, a renowned socialite of her era, and it is worth more than 10 years of your miserable salary. I swear before all these witnesses that if you can play it, if you can pull even one decent melody from its strings, I will marry you this very night." The laughter from the crowd surged louder, with one woman letting out a high-pitched squeal of delight, while a gentleman puffing on a thick cigar clapped his hands in sheer entertainment. "Go on, Maxwell, let the little maid play for us," chanted two young heirs, swaying slightly with champagne flutes in their hands. Rachel felt her face burning hot, not entirely from the thick, suffocating smoke of public shame, but from something far deeper that she had kept buried for 8 long years. It had all started 15 minutes earlier with a remarkably foolish accident as she navigated the crowded room with her tray. A careless gentleman had stepped backward without looking, his elbow striking her arm and sending 3 full glasses of champagne tumbling forward. The golden liquid splashed directly across the ivory silk bodice of Jessica Crawford, the most feared and calculating woman in Newport high society. Jessica had spent the last 6 months weaving a patient, sticky web around Maxwell Anderson, fully intending to secure a diamond ring by the end of the social season. "You stupid, clumsy creature," Jessica had shrieked, leaping backward as the dark stain expanded across her impossibly expensive gown. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? It is worth more than your entire miserable life." Rachel had immediately murmured a quiet apology, quickly pulling a clean cloth from her apron to help, but Jessica aggressively slapped her hand away. "Do not touch me with your filthy hands," Jessica spat, turning her furious gaze toward their host. "Maxwell, darling, please tell me you are going to throw this incompetent girl out onto the street immediately." That was when Maxwell, watching the dramatic scene unfold with the bored elegance of a man who had seen everything money could buy, allowed a slow, predatory smile to creep across his face. "Simply firing her would be far too boring," he declared smoothly. "Why don't we have a little bit of fun first?" He walked over to a brilliantly illuminated glass display case against the far wall, where his late grandmother's cherished violin had rested in absolute silence for 30 years. "Oh, brilliant idea," Jessica purred, recovering her composure and eager to participate in the cruel theater. Let the maid play. It will be absolutely hysterical to watch her scratch at that thing like a dying cat. And afterward, we can throw her out and laugh about it over dessert." For the first time all evening, Rachel lifted her green eyes from the floor, but she did not look at Jessica or the wall of silk and diamonds surrounding her. She looked at the violin, and her heart completely stopped in her chest. She did not recognize this specific instrument, but she recognized exactly what it was. The perfect curve of the wooden body, the faded golden varnish, right where the chin of generations of musicians had rested, the ebony pegs, and the strings. Simply by looking at the tension, she could tell it was slightly out of tune, recognizing it the way one notices an old friend has aged. Her hands, gripping the edges of the silver tray, instinctively twitched with muscle memory that her sheer willpower had spent years forcing into submission. "Well?" Maxwell challenged, waving the priceless instrument in the perfumed air. "Are you just going to stand there like a frightened statue? I am offering you the absolute opportunity of a lifetime, girl. A humble little maid transforming into the lady of the Anderson estate. That is the ultimate dream for any woman of your lower class, is it not?" The ballroom erupted into another roar of mocking laughter, but near the grand piano, a younger guest frowned, disturbed by the strange, profound stillness radiating from the maid. Back by the swinging kitchen doors, Mrs. Ruth, the 60-year-old estate cook, clutched a dish towel to her chest, while Tommy, the clumsy young footman, swallowed hard in distress. "We have to get Rachel out of there," Tommy whispered anxiously. "Hush," Mrs. Ruth ordered, never taking her eyes off the young woman. Mrs. Ruth knew there was something hidden within Rachel. Once, during a raging thunderstorm, she had seen the maid standing by the kitchen window, her fingers dancing in the empty air as if playing an invisible instrument, wearing an expression of someone who remembered having wings. "Look at her closely," Jessica sneered, parading around Rachel like a vulture inspecting a fresh carcass. "Look at those hands, red and blistered from scrubbing our floors, wearing a $3 uniform. Where on earth does a lowly maid get green eyes like that? She probably stole them from someone important." She let out a vicious giggle, prompting several other society ladies to echo her spite. "Come on, girl, play it, or confess right now that you are exactly what you appear to be. Absolutely nothing." Rachel did not answer, but something shifted deep inside her chest, like a massive sheet of winter ice, finally beginning to crack and give way beneath a frozen river. For 8 years, she had quietly accepted the insults, the heavy trays, the cold little room next to the pantry, believing that making herself small and invisible would protect her. But tonight, the world had aggressively shoved a violin directly into her face, and a violin is never just an object to a woman who once possessed the miraculous power to make 1,000 strangers weep with merely 4 strings and a wooden bow. 12 hours before Maxwell forced the fateful violin into her hands, Rachel Sullivan was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the white marble floor of the grand entrance hall, entirely unrecognizable from the woman she used to be. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, and the massive Newport estate, with its 30 luxurious bedrooms and high vaulted ceilings, was completely silent and asleep. She loved this quiet early hour, before the demanding bells rang, before Jessica Crawford's shrill voice echoed down the corridors demanding her morning tea, when the house belonged only to the rhythmic, circular motions of her soapy rag. "You are going to scrub a hole straight through that stone, my girl," Mrs. Ruth announced warmly, emerging from the warm kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. "That floor already shines brighter than my favorite copper pots. Come sit on the steps and rest for a minute." Rachel sat back on her heels, wiping her damp brow with the back of her sleeve, and accepted the hot mug with a grateful smile. Mrs. Ruth was a wonderfully round woman of 60, her apron perpetually smelling of sweet cinnamon and roasted onions, and she was the closest thing to a mother Rachel had known in almost a decade. "Thank you, Mrs. Ruth," Rachel murmured softly, letting the warmth seep into her cold, red hands. "But if I do not finish before the wealthy guests wake up, you know exactly how Miss Crawford will react." The cook let out a loud, dismissive snort, sitting heavily on the bottom marble step. That awful woman would throw a tantrum even if we served her breakfast on a solid gold platter, with angels singing in the background. She only moved into this house to trap the master, and until he puts a diamond on her finger, she will take her frustration out on whoever she can. Which unfortunately means you. Rachel took a slow sip of her bitter coffee, knowing the older woman was entirely correct. Jessica Crawford had installed herself in the guest wing 6 months ago, under the flimsy guise of being a close family friend. But every servant knew she was ruthlessly determined to become Mrs. Anderson. "Tell me, is it true the master is throwing a massive party tonight?" Mrs. Ruth asked, leaning in conspiratorially. "Tommy said we are expecting over 200 high society folks for his 31st birthday." "Yes," Rachel replied quietly, gazing down at her reflection in the wet marble. "Over 200 people, and we must have everything absolutely flawless by 8 o'clock in the evening." The cook shook her head sadly, noting that a man with all the money in the world still walked around as if the universe owed him a debt. He was a sweet boy before his parents perished in that terrible airplane crash. She noted softly, "Grief makes a person own everything, but value nothing." The ensuing afternoon blurred into a chaotic whirlwind of frantic preparations. Professional florists marched through the double doors carrying extravagant arrangements the size of small trees, while a rented orchestra tuned their instruments in the corner of the grand ballroom under a canopy of crystal lights. Tommy the footman nearly collided with a passing waiter, balancing a precarious tower of fine china plates that swayed dangerously with his every step. "Rachel, help me!" Tommy gasped, his knees buckling slightly. "If I drop these plates, Miss Crawford will personally hang me from the chandelier." Rachel laughed, gracefully taking half the heavy stack from his trembling arms. "You always try to carry too much in one trip, Tommy." The young footman sighed dramatically, declaring that, in this house, you lose even when you win, before scurrying off toward the dining room. "Hey, the one with the green eyes." Jessica's sharp voice sliced through the corridor like a freshly sharpened blade. Rachel stopped immediately, clutching a bundle of fresh white tablecloths tightly to her chest. "Go up to my suite, and carefully iron the ivory silk dress I left on the bed," Jessica commanded with a cruel smirk. "And if you make a single incorrect crease, I swear I will have you thrown out onto the street without a single letter of recommendation. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Rachel replied softly, keeping her eyes cast downward to hide the flash of resentment. "How beautifully obedient," Jessica mocked loudly for her passing friends to hear. "People of your class always know exactly where they belong." Rachel walked silently up the grand staircase, knowing that arguing would only extend her punishment. Alone in the extravagant guest bedroom, while meticulously pressing the delicate ivory silk, Rachel paused to look at herself in the massive, gold-framed floor mirror. A pale, exhausted maid with dark shadows under her bright green eyes stared back, looking like an absolute stranger. "Where did you go?" she whispered to her reflection. 8 years ago, in another city, she was Rachel Sullivan, the famous child prodigy whose name glowed brightly on prestigious theater marquees. By the age of 7, she was playing complex concertos entirely from memory. By 12, she had debuted as a professional soloist. And by 19, severe critics hailed her as the miracle of the strings. She had a brilliant, golden future laid out before her, until a rainy night changed the trajectory of her entire existence in a matter of seconds. She closed her eyes tightly, but the memory rushed in with vicious clarity, as it always did when she lowered her guard. She saw her father, Ethan Sullivan, desperately turning the steering wheel as their car skidded across the slick black asphalt. The blinding headlights of the oncoming truck, the deafening shatter of glass, and then a profound silence. Ethan, her teacher and best friend, had died instantly, while Rachel survived with a shattered right hand and a broken heart that no surgeon could ever stitch back together. Though physical therapy eventually healed her bones, every time she picked up her bow, She heard the horrific crunch of metal and her father's final, desperate shout. Crushed by mounting medical debts and crippling trauma, she sold her custom-made violin, packed her faded press clippings into a cardboard box, and buried Rachel Sullivan forever to become a nameless maid who scrubbed marble floors. Back in the brightly lit ballroom, the tension hung so thick it could be cut with a silver knife. Rachel took the ancient, honey-colored violin from Maxwell, handling it with a startling delicacy that severely contrasted with her red, blistered hands. She did not grab it like an unfamiliar object. She held it with the profound reverence of someone embracing a beloved family member who had returned from the dead. Maxwell held out the wooden bow with a highly arrogant smirk, saying, "Here is the little stick. Let us hear what awful noise you can make." Rachel accepted the bow without looking at his face, entirely absorbed by the familiar weight of the wood, the sharp scent of old rosin, and the cold curve of the chin rest settling perfectly against her jaw. She closed her green eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. She raised the bow, rested it gently against the taut strings, and played her very first note. It was not a screech, nor was it the sound of the dying cat Jessica had so viciously predicted. It was a remarkably long, pure, deeply rounded sound that soared effortlessly above the diamond-studded crowd, rising to vibrate against the crystal chandeliers hanging far above their heads. That single, flawless, sustained note sliced through the heavy, perfumed air like a stream of freezing water, paralyzing all 200 guests where they stood. The cruel laughter died instantly in their throats. Rachel felt the music bypass her conscious thought, her fingers automatically finding the complex positions of the meditation from Thais, the exact same piece she had played 8 years ago on the last night she was ever truly alive. The melody poured out of her soul not as a distant memory, but as a fresh, bleeding wound opened for the entire world to witness. The bow moved up and down with impossible, fluid grace, weaving a sound so heartbreakingly sweet and devastatingly sad that the wealthy onlookers had no idea how to process their own emotions. A society matron who had been mocking her just moments before suddenly pressed a gloved hand to her quivering lips. An elderly gentleman sitting near the grand piano closed his eyes tightly as a tear slipped down his wrinkled cheek. The music did not merely enter their ears, it bypassed their logic and pierced directly into their chests, speaking to whatever secret grief each person carried. A lost love, a dead parent, a forgotten dream, forcing them to remember everything they tried to forget. Rachel was no longer trapped in a hostile ballroom in Newport. She was transported back to her childhood, where the entire universe shrank to 4 tight strings and the steady rhythm of her own beating heart. Her body swayed naturally with the sweeping phrases, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration, the cheap blue uniform falling away in the minds of the audience to reveal the undisputed queen of the strings underneath. The haunting memories returned, but this time they did not arrive as cutting knives. They washed over her like gentle waves. She saw her father Ethan sitting in the front row of a grand theater, wiping away tears of pride with a crumpled white handkerchief, whispering his golden rule. "Do not play for the critics, my girl. Play for those who are gone, because music is the only language that crosses over to the other side." In the very back row of the stunned crowd, Arthur Belmont, a highly respected elderly patron of the New York Symphony, leaned heavily on his wooden cane, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He had spent 60 years listening to the most magnificent violinists across the globe, and the unique, breathtaking way this young woman attacked the phrasing stirred a deeply buried memory in his mind. "I have heard this exact sound before," the old man thought wildly, his heart racing. Maxwell Anderson's arrogant smile had vanished completely. Standing merely 3 feet away, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, he stared at his maid, as if seeing a divine apparition. This woman he had meant to humiliate was playing his late grandmother's instrument with a level of virtuosity he had never witnessed in his entire privileged existence. The mockery frozen on Maxwell's face rapidly melted into profound astonishment, followed swiftly by a crushing wave of deep shame. But there was something far more terrifying happening beneath his ribs. The achingly familiar melody was violently dragging the ghost of his dead mother back into the room. His mother used to play this very violin when he was a small boy, the sweet notes lulling him to sleep through the heavy oak doors of his childhood bedroom. When her airplane tragically crashed into the ocean, he had banished the instrument into a glass cage, forbidding anyone to ever make it sing again, because the grief was entirely too much to bear. Now, this humble maid had unlocked the cage, and the beautiful, agonizing voice of his mother was flooding the ballroom, cracking the thick ice that had encased Maxwell's heart for almost 2 decades. Jessica Crawford was currently experiencing the most spectacular nightmare of her carefully calculated life. She had meticulously envisioned the maid scratching terribly at the strings, the crowd roaring with laughter, and the satisfying finality of watching the girl thrown out into the cold night. Instead, this supposed nobody was bringing the most exclusive echelon of East Coast society to absolute tears. Worse still, Jessica saw the raw, vulnerable expression on Maxwell's face as he watched Rachel play, recognizing the look of a man whose very soul was being irrevocably captured. The music swelled toward its magnificent climax, Rachel holding an impossibly high, delicate note that hung in the silence like a shimmering thread of golden light before she let it descend slowly, gently, into complete and utter silence. The final beautiful note faded away, and for 3 eternally long seconds, absolutely nothing happened in the grand room. Nobody clapped, nobody whispered, nobody dared to draw a breath. These ruthless businessmen and cynical socialites, completely accustomed to never being impressed by anything their vast fortunes could not buy, were left completely speechless and hollowed out by the sheer emotional power of the performance. Rachel slowly opened her green eyes, lowering the wooden violin from her jaw, and upon seeing 200 tear-stained faces staring back at her, she suddenly remembered exactly who she was supposed to be. Pure panic flashed across her pale face like a dark shadow. She had completely shattered the single most important rule of her survival, remaining invisible, and had accidentally made herself the brightest, most visible person in the entire state of Rhode Island. Then, the applause finally erupted. It was not polite, refined clapping. It was a deafening, thunderous avalanche of sound. Dozens of people leapt to their feet simultaneously, their heavy wooden chairs scraping loudly against the parquet floor, shouting ecstatic praises that bounced off the high-painted ceilings. The elderly Arthur Belmont wept openly, hammering his wooden cane against the floor in profound approval, while the hired waiters stood frozen against the walls, completely forgetting their silver trays. By the kitchen doors, Mrs. Ruth pressed her apron to her face, sobbing with overwhelming pride. "That is my girl," the 60-year-old cook repeated through her happy tears. "I always knew she had magic inside her." Beside her, Tommy clapped his hands so hard they turned bright red. Rachel stood frozen in the exact center of the storm, clutching the priceless violin tightly to her chest, like a protective wooden shield. She did not offer a graceful smile or take a theatrical bow. She desperately wanted to run away, to hide in her freezing little room near the pantry, because this deafening praise was ripping the heavy iron doors off the painful past she had fought so hard to lock away. Maxwell took a slow, deliberate step toward her, causing the roaring crowd to quiet down, eagerly anticipating the conclusion of the millionaire's dramatic bet. Everyone distinctly remembered the promise he had shouted just minutes before. "If you play this violin, I will marry you right here, right now." He stopped directly in front of her, his dark eyes searching hers, completely stripped of their previous arrogant cruelty. Maxwell opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word could leave his lips, a shrill, desperate voice sliced through the charged atmosphere. "Wait just 1 minute." Jessica Crawford marched toward them, her face heavily distorted with ugly rage, a twisted smile plastered over her panic. Before anyone does anything utterly foolish, there is something you all need to know about this manipulative little creature." The ballroom went dead silent, and Rachel felt the blood turn to freezing ice in her veins. Do you honestly believe a simple maid randomly plays like a master by sheer coincidence? Jessica spat venomously, pointing a manicured finger at Rachel's chest. She is a fraud, a professional grifter who sneaked into this wealthy estate pretending to be poor, undoubtedly planning to steal the silver. A wave of highly uncomfortable murmurs washed over the gathered guests, though nobody truly believed someone playing with such profound heartbreak could be a common thief. Maxwell raised a commanding hand, his voice dropping to a dangerously cold register. "Jessica, shut your mouth immediately," he ordered, never breaking his intense eye contact with Rachel. It was as though he had physically struck the socialite, causing Jessica to step backward in pale, trembling fury. "We have all just witnessed a miracle that none of our vast millions could ever purchase," Maxwell stated firmly, turning his full attention back to the trembling maid. "Now, please tell me, what is your real name? The name you had before you put on that uniform." 200 pairs of eyes burned into Rachel's skin. The overwhelming temptation to confess the truth, that she was Rachel Sullivan, the lost prodigy, the miracle of the strings whose father had died on a slick highway, rose in her throat, but the paralyzing fear of the ensuing pity and media circus choked it back down. "I am just Rachel," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "I am just the maid, and I do not want your money, your attention, or your marriage proposal. Please, Mr. Anderson, just let me return to the kitchen and pretend this never happened." A bizarre silence fell over the crowd. Never in the history of Newport had any woman publicly rejected Maxwell Anderson, begging instead to return to scrubbing his marble floors as if his immense wealth were a curse. Maxwell's pride twitched, but it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce, undeniable fascination. He realized this woman was the most profound mystery he had ever encountered in his hollow, privileged life. "Pick up your silver tray," he instructed softly, almost gently, "and put my grandmother's violin back in its case. We will speak tomorrow, because this is far from over." Rachel bowed her head, carefully returning the instrument, and fled toward the kitchen doors, feeling the heavy weight of 200 stares burning into her back. Once safe inside the warm kitchen, she collapsed into Mrs. Ruth's loving arms, sobbing uncontrollably about how exposing her music felt like reopening her father's grave. "Do not bury your gift because of fear, my sweet girl," Mrs. Ruth murmured wisely, stroking Rachel's hair. "The dead are honored by our living, not by our hiding." Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Jessica cornered her sleazy cousin Richard, hissing an order to dig up every dark secret the maid had ever buried. During the next 2 weeks, the icy atmosphere inside the Newport mansion shifted dramatically, though Rachel and Maxwell were the only two pretending not to notice. Maxwell found completely absurd excuses to cross paths with the quiet maid, specifically requesting that Rachel deliver his black coffee to his private study, entirely ignoring the electronic bell designed to summon the footman. He would purposefully wander down to the bustling kitchen, lingering far longer than appropriate, leaning against the counter to listen to Mrs. Ruth's stories, while stealing lingering glances at the girl with the bright green eyes. Rachel, despite her fierce determination to remain invisible, felt the heavy walls around her heart softening. Tommy swore he heard her softly humming a classical tune while meticulously folding the heavy linen bedsheets. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Maxwell discovered Rachel standing inside his late mother's grand music room, a beautifully decorated space that had remained securely locked and covered in white dust sheets for 18 long years. She had slipped inside, drawn by the irresistible pull of a covered upright piano, her calloused fingers gently tracing the yellowed ivory keys with a terribly wistful expression. "Oh, I am so sorry. I should not be in here," Rachel gasped, quickly pulling her hand away, but Maxwell stepped inside and softly closed the heavy oak door behind him. "Please, stay," he requested quietly, pulling the dusty sheet off a velvet armchair. "This was where my mother played, and I used to sit right here doing my homework. I locked it away the day we buried her, because the memories hurt too much." Rachel looked at him, recognizing the raw, unfiltered grief of a fellow orphan, her fear evaporating into a profound sense of shared understanding. "Play something for me," Maxwell asked gently, his dark eyes pleading. "Right here, where she used to sit." And so Rachel sat on the wooden bench and played a simple, tender lullaby her father Ethan used to hum, filling the dead room with vibrant life once more. As the sweet notes floated through the dusty air, a single, silent tear rolled down Maxwell's cheek, washing away nearly 2 decades of carefully constructed arrogance. In that quiet, sacred space, the billionaire and the maid ceased to exist, leaving only 2 broken souls, desperately using music to build a bridge across their immense pain. However, hidden in the dark, wood-paneled library down the hall, Jessica Crawford and her cousin Richard were busy actively poisoning that very bridge. Richard, wearing an oily, satisfied grin, spread a dozen yellowed newspaper clippings across the mahogany desk, having successfully raided the archives of the New York City Library. "Look at this, dear cousin," Richard sneered, tapping a photograph of a much younger Rachel. "Her name is Rachel Sullivan, the famous child prodigy whose father was killed in a horrific car crash 8 years ago. She vanished into thin air after the hospital sued her for massive unpaid medical debts." Jessica's eyes gleamed with pure, unadulterated malice as she absorbed the tragic history of her rival. "She is a professional liar who entered this wealthy estate using a fake identity," Jessica purred dangerously. "And I know exactly how to get rid of her forever." Jessica reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a velvet box containing the late grandmother's spectacular emerald and diamond necklace, worth well over $2 million. "I secured the combination to Maxwell's private safe 3 weeks ago, when he carelessly left his notebook out," Jessica explained with a chillingly calm demeanor. "Tonight, during the incredibly important dinner with his 50 corporate partners, I will suddenly discover this priceless heirloom is missing." She slipped out of the library and crept silently up the narrow service stairs, pushing open the door to Rachel's freezing little room. Ignoring the absolute poverty of the space, she shoved the velvet box deep inside Rachel's worn cardboard box, right underneath the cherished photograph of Rachel and her father that bore the inscription, "Daddy and me forever." The high-stakes dinner party commenced precisely at 9 o'clock in the evening. The long mahogany table crowded with 50 of the most powerful real estate tycoons on the East Coast. Jessica sat strategically to Maxwell's right, wearing a stunning red dress, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Maxwell's gaze continuously darted toward Rachel, who was quietly pouring expensive red wine at the far end of the room. When dessert was finally served, Jessica suddenly gasped loudly, bringing both of her manicured hands dramatically to her bare collarbone. "Oh my heavens! The emerald necklace!" she cried out, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Maxwell, we placed your grandmother's necklace on the parlor table just this afternoon to admire it, and now it is completely gone." A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the 50 powerful guests, their forks freezing mid-air over their chocolate soufflés. "That is impossible," Maxwell frowned deeply, setting down his crystal glass. "I personally locked that necklace inside the wall safe. No, darling, it is missing, and the only people who have been upstairs today are the servants," Jessica insisted, projecting her voice so every corporate partner could hear her feigned distress. "For the honor of your family name, Maxwell, you must have the security team search the staff quarters immediately, starting with that green-eyed maid who lied about her true identity." Rachel, standing by the antique sideboard with a silver tray in her hands, felt the floor vanish entirely beneath her feet. Less than 10 minutes later, a burly estate security guard marched heavily down the grand staircase, gripping the familiar velvet box in his large hands. He stopped at the head of the dining table and snapped the box open, revealing the massive emerald and diamond necklace glittering maliciously under the crystal chandelier. "I found it hidden deep inside a cardboard box under the bed in the maid's room, sir," the guard announced gruffly. A collective gasp of sheer horror rippled through the 50 wealthy dinner guests. Rachel's face drained of all color, her trembling hands losing their grip on the heavy silver tray, which crashed violently onto the marble floor in an explosion of shattered glass. "No, I swear I did not take it," Rachel cried out, pressing her back against the wall. "Mr. Anderson, please, I would never steal anything from you." Mrs. Ruth pushed violently through the swinging kitchen doors, her face bright red with absolute fury. "That is a wicked lie!" the 60-year-old cook bellowed, pointing an accusing finger at Jessica. "Sleeps in a freezing room without heat, and has never asked for a single extra penny. Only a complete fool would believe a real thief hides priceless jewels in their own tiny closet, where anyone could find them. Ask yourselves who truly benefits from this girl being thrown out." "Silence, you insolent old woman, or I will have you thrown into the street as well," Jessica shrieked, momentarily losing her carefully crafted, elegant composure. "Do you see the absolute chaos you have allowed in your home, Maxwell? A den of thieving servants covering for each other." Every eye in the opulent dining room swung heavily toward Maxwell Anderson, waiting to see how the powerful tycoon would handle this scandalous betrayal. Maxwell stared at the glittering emeralds on the table, then at his 50 judgmental corporate partners, and finally at Rachel, whose beautiful green eyes were pleading with him to trust the connection they had built. But the immense pressure of his social standing, combined with Jessica's relentless venom, forced a tiny, fatal drop of doubt into his mind. "You lied to me about your real name when you applied to work here," Maxwell said slowly, his voice sounding hollow and strange in his own ears. "Why should I believe you are telling the truth now?" The agonizing question struck Rachel harder than any physical blow ever could, instantly killing the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in her chest. He did not look like a man who believed in her. He looked exactly like a cold, calculating judge weighing a bad investment. "I told you my deepest, most painful truth yesterday in the music room," Rachel whispered, a single tear cutting a hot path down her pale cheek. "I gave you the most broken parts of my soul, and the moment it becomes inconvenient, you choose to doubt me. Do not play the victim," Jessica snapped triumphantly. "Throw the thief out, Maxwell, before I call the police myself." "I will not call the authorities," Maxwell stated firmly, refusing to look at Rachel's shattered expression. "But I cannot have a suspected thief working in this house. Pack your meager belongings and leave my property tonight." Rachel stood perfectly straight, wiping the tear from her face, suddenly finding a reservoir of profound, unbreakable dignity. "I will leave, Mr. Anderson, but not because I am guilty," Rachel said, her voice ringing clear and steady through the massive dining room. "I am leaving because I refuse to remain in a place where I am not believed, and I truly hope your cold jewels keep you warm at night." She untied her white apron, laid it carefully over a velvet chair, and walked out the back door without ever looking back. After being falsely accused and humiliated, Rachel left Maxwell's mansion and walked 3 kilometers through a freezing rainstorm, with only her father's photograph, promising she would never allow anyone to silence her music again. Back at the mansion, Maxwell discovered security footage, proving that Jessica had stolen the necklace, planted the evidence, and framed Rachel. Overwhelmed with guilt, he admitted his cowardice, while Mrs. Ruth demanded he publicly correct the injustice. The following afternoon, Maxwell gathered the same guests who had witnessed Rachel's humiliation and exposed Jessica's crimes before everyone. The scandal destroyed Jessica's reputation. Richard confessed his involvement, and both were permanently cast out of society. Determined to make amends, Maxwell recovered Rachel's treasured violin from a collector and found her at a small repair shop in Boston. Instead of asking for forgiveness, he returned the instrument and promised to become someone who would protect her music rather than silence it. Rachel accepted the violin, and, as its beautiful sound filled the room, The pain of the past finally began to heal. 6 months later, she performed triumphantly before a sold-out audience at New York Symphony Hall, while Maxwell proudly watched from the front row. Their journey revealed that true strength comes from facing the past instead of hiding from it, that love requires patience, forgiveness, and courage, and that healing begins when we choose authenticity, redemption, and the willingness to let both music and compassion guide our lives.